I've never driven a TVR. And for somebody working for PistonHeads, that's frankly unacceptable. Because for those of you who don't know, in 1998, PistonHeads launched as a car discussion forum, but it was quickly overrun with TVR owners complaining about everything from leaky roofs to wonky trim. Now, obviously, we've come quite a long way since then, but Blackpool's best still has a soft spot in our hearts. And as we're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, I thought now was the perfect time to finally get acquainted with TVR. And what better way to do it than with the car that many consider to be the company's greatest of all time, the Sagaris.
Remember to head over to PistonHeads.com to research and buy your next car. The Sagaris came at a particularly turbulent time in TVR's bumpy history. Launched in 2005, a year after the company's former CEO, Peter Wheeler, handed the keys over to a then 24-year-old Russian businessman, the Sagaris marked a giant leap forward for the British marque as it aimed to join the ranks of the world's top sports car makers. A crazy design that made the space-age styling of the Tuscan look rather vanilla by comparison, and dynamics that would put to rest TVR's Widowmaker reputation, resulted in the most complete car to come out of Blackpool. Unfortunately, it would also be TVR's last.
And boy, did it go out with a fair dose of exuberance. The Sagaris is littered with details that were utterly bonkers back in 2005, and yet somehow it all just seems to come together. These gills on the wheel arches, for instance, you've heard the story that they were filled in because on the prototype it was allegedly kicking stones up into the windscreen. But I've recently heard that it was actually filled in to save on money, because otherwise you'd have to paint the inside of the wheel arches. And it kind of seems to make sense, because surely they could have fixed it by just putting a bit of mesh down. Onto the single bulge roof. Now, the design was intended so that the driver can wear a crash helmet without bashing their head against the roof, but the passenger doesn't get one, so you better hope that they're short. But it's at the back of the car where the Sagaris really stands out from among the rest. You have the Perspex rear spoiler held up by these three metal struts, and of course the rear side exit exhausts. On other cars you've seen them further up, but you just never see them out the back like this. Now, I've heard some rumours that it was actually a Tuscan exhaust system that was so long that they had to bend it around, and also it was done for aerodynamic purposes. I don't believe any of that. I think it was done because it just looks freaking cool. But as a whole, it's such a radical look. We see car manufacturers do some really bold designs at the moment, but no one could pull off a daring design quite like TVR could.
One of the reasons it was able to produce such eccentric designs on such a small budget is that TVR made extensive use of glass fibre. Couple that with a space frame chassis and the Sagaris tips the scales at just 1,078 kilograms. It was also built considerably better than TVRs that came before it. Daniel Boardman, the chief engineer for the Sagaris, was adamant that it was put together properly and watertight, neither of which were a given on previous TVRs.
And that's what makes this particular car interesting, because you hear all these horror stories of TVRs blowing up and falling apart, but this Sagaris has covered 94,000 miles. Now, admittedly, it's had a couple of engine refreshes in that time, but it just goes to show that the two previous owners really cherished it. Now, it's actually up for sale on PistonHeads.com through HPC Classics for $62,995, and I'll link to that down in the description. Back to the engine. It's a 4-litre naturally aspirated straight six, producing 412 horsepower and 349 pound-feet of torque. Now, what's almost unheard of in today's low-volume sports car world is that the engine was built by TVR itself. It's called the Speed 6. Now, if the idea of owning a car with an engine built in-house by a car manufacturer that doesn't exist anymore is a little bit terrifying, then worry not, because if you head over to PistonHeads.com, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of forum posts from people who have either owned the car or are specialists and know the car like the back of their hand, if not better, because who knows what the back of their hand looks like. TVR really didn't like door handles, because not only do you not get them on the outside of the car, because God forbid, you wouldn't want to complicate the exterior design, but there aren't any on the inside either. If you want to get out, you've got to push a button on the dashboard here, which doesn't make any sense at all, but I completely love it. It just adds to the mystique of TVR. It also doesn't have any airbags. Now, we actually did an interview with Peter Wheeler back in 2004, and I'll link it down in the description. We asked him, why don't TVRs have airbags? And he said, look at this roll cage. You don't get that in most cars, and if you were to roll one of ours over, you'd be doing all right. Dodging the question somewhat, but he did say he thought that airbags were actually unsafe, as was traction control and anti-lock brakes, which is why the Sagaris doesn't have any of it. Fit and finish though is pretty good. It's a lot better than I was expecting. You have metal finish on the dials over here and in the center console, on the gear lever, the handbrake, and you've also got leather pretty much everywhere. The only thing that really has stood out to me though are the indicators and wipers, because these are exactly the same stalks that I have in my Ford Fiesta ST150. But TVR's tried to jazz things up a little bit by putting these little Alcantara kind of like hoods on them, so it looks posher than it actually is. Another word on TVR's reputation. Not only were they built a little bit British, but they were also notoriously difficult to drive. You feel like you'd be approaching the limit and then all of a sudden it'd bite you out of nowhere. So when Boardman was heading up the engineering project of the Sagaris, he wanted to not only make the build quality a lot better, but he also wanted them to drive properly, be far more predictable. So while the space frame chassis is very similar to what you'll find in a lot of other TVRs, the company actually approached Bilstein and Multimatic to completely rework the suspension. It's also a little bit wider at the front and rear to improve stability. The result is a car that was considerably easier to use than most of its predecessors. And so while you look at a Sagaris and think it just seems like a complete madman that's going to kill you, it's actually, dare I say, quite refined. And on that note of it being relatively accessible, yes, it doesn't have traction control, but the accelerator is actually really long, so you're not just stabbing away at the throttle, spinning up the rear tires. It's really progressive acceleration. And then there are the brakes. Now, I've mentioned that there's no ABS, but the pedal is actually unassisted. So there's barely any movement. It's like hitting the brakes in a racing car. And you'd think that would be completely dire on the road, but it's just super intuitive and it makes the controls feel super tight. Couple that up with just really lovely steering. You get in a car from 2005 and they can often feel quite lazy in their steering, but this is just wonderfully precise. Just all the controls feel super tight. But the big thing is the engine. I mean, I am in love with it. It doesn't boom when you're on throttle, but when you lift off, you get this wonderful backing track of crackles and pops that just makes it sound characterful, alive. It doesn't sound super refined, which, you know, it isn't. But my goodness, when you're on it, I mean, the noise of this thing. It is sublime. And this actual car has actually got a quieter exhaust than stock. It's got a slightly newer exhaust system, which isn't as loud as the standard car would have. And I think it's perfect. It still sounded super loud when we fired it up. You can probably tell that I'm having to raise my voice a little bit to be able to talk to you. But it's nothing that I would find obtrusive or grating on a long drive. Just sounds raw. I think what just really surprises me about this specific car though is that at 94,000 miles, it feels really tight. This is a TVR. Everyone's been telling me that they'll fall to pieces. That we have bits of trim hitting me in the face. But it feels fine, it feels great. Probably didn't feel all this different to when it came out of Blackpool. God, how many years ago now? 18? And that's my takeaway of driving this Sagaris. I've just heard so many horror stories over the years of people saying, don't own one, you'll come to resent it and it'll just break down and cause you misery. But I think this 94,000 mile example just shows that if it's been well looked after, you can still enjoy it for what I presume will be many more miles to come. And there are plenty of experts out there. You know, the TVR community is one of the most passionate and most knowledgeable. So if you do need someone to help you out, there's someone there for you. And I'm sorry if those stories do put you off from buying a TVR, because you'll be missing out on a truly unique driving experience. It's the engine, it's the ultra tight controls, and the absolute bizarre button arrangement in the cabin. There is simply nothing like this. Nobody came close to doing what TVR did 18 odd years ago.
If you enjoyed this video, we'd really appreciate a thumbs up, and hey, why not subscribe to the PistonHeads channel so that you're the first to know when a new video goes live.